Shalom, I'm Chris. Let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Lesson 29, we're calling this one Missionary Minded, and we'll be at the end of Matthew 9, and we'll look at the first part of Matthew chapter 10. It's a long discourse. It's called the Missionary Discourse, and we'll look at verses, begins at verse 5 of chapter 10. We'll look at the first few verses this time and then pick up the rest next time. Father, we ask you to bless our study and have us be like the Bereans, who receive the word with all eagerness, but who examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. And by this teaching, let us remember the words of James and be doers of your word and not hearers only. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So we're calling this one Missionary Minded, and as we go through, we'll take some action points from Jesus' words and his teaching to remind us to be missionary minded and the things we can expect and how we need to curb our behavior to be like his disciples who are going out on the mission field. So first, we'll look at a couple of more healings that Matthew adds that the other gospel writers don't have. There'd be a blind man and a mute demoniac. And then he'll get into the end of chapter 9. We'll be talking about how he needs workers for the harvest. And that'll be our memory passage where Jesus says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, pray to the Lord of the harvest to send workers into his harvest. And that's us. In the immediate context, it is the apostles whom he's going to send out. But in our day, this is definitely something he wants his disciples to be doing, is being missionary minded and ready for the mission field. Then we'll get into the missionary discourse itself. The first part will be trusting on God for provisions, and then he'll get into handling rejection. And then the big part, which we'll tackle next time, is the persecution. And that's the part a lot of people don't like because it's not comfortable. But it's something Jesus tells us to expect. And all the history of the church is full of Christian persecution. So we've been spared that for some reason in our Western cultures over the last few hundred years. But really, there are some reasons to believe that may be changing. And certainly believers around the world are definitely more accustomed to persecution than we are. Much of the Apostles' discourse is going to involve trusting in the Lord, even and maybe especially when our circumstances cause us to fear. And so this reminds me of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths, or as the NASB says, he will make your paths straight. So as we go through this, we can imagine the apostles had questions, right? What if we don't pack enough provisions? Jesus' response is trust in the Lord. What if we're rejected? Trust in the Lord. What if we're physically attacked? Well, then trust in the Lord. And so to be missionary minded, and I'll have these little pop-ups as we go through the video here, the missionary minded realize that faith is greater than fear. Leaning on our own understanding leads us to fear. And that's why it says over and over again in the Bible, do not fear, or something like it. Trusting in the Lord to make our path straight requires faith. If you don't already have Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 committed to memory, you really should. It's just a fantastic verse. And as we move through this lesson, let that be our theme. And the theme is trusting in Jesus, and faith is stronger than fear. As Jesus went on from there, two men who were blind followed him, crying out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." And after he entered the house, the men who were blind came up to him. And Jesus said to them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" And they said to him, "Yes, Lord." So before we get into the missionary section, Matthew includes a few more healings that the other gospel writers do not. Jesus asked something very interesting here. He hasn't asked this before at any time. He says, "Do you believe I am able to do this?" And so the question for us is, do we trust in his abilities? The people who wanted healing, did they believe it? Chuck Missler used to say that Jesus finds new ways every day to ask, do you trust me? And so the missionary minded trust him. And so when we're challenged with trusting in our own understanding or trusting in him, how do we respond? How do I respond? The missionary minded put their trust in him. And of course, here the blind men answer yes. Now, in the Gospels, it's interesting, and especially the Gospel of John, the blind often have more spiritual sight than those with vision. And there'll be a point where the leadership says to Jesus, "What, are you calling us blind?" And Jesus basically says, "Well, if the shoe fits, then you're blind," after he's just healed someone who's blind. Then back in Matthew 9, he touched their eyes, saying, "It shall be done for you according to your faith." And their eyes were opened. And Jesus sternly warned them, saying, "See that no one knows about this." But of course, they went out and spread the news about him throughout the land. So back in verse 27, it says, Jesus went on from there. The there is almost certainly Capernaum. To bring us up to date, Jesus has just finished teaching the parables, if we go by Mark and Luke's account. Then he gets into a boat and he avoid the big crowds. And then that's when he has the storm and he's asleep and he gets up and calms the storm. He goes to the other side, heals the demoniac at Gadara, and then returns back to the same crowds that are in Capernaum and encounters the woman with the issue of blood, and he heals Jairus' daughter. So again, all one sequence. According to some gospel writers, Matthew has it broken up. He'll have the parables in chapter 13, and he has this here. So we don't know if it's one, a couple all over a couple of days, or if we're blending different days. We just aren't sure. But anyway, at the end of Matthew 9, he organizes these to communicate that Jesus is demonstrating his authority over human suffering and the spirit world. And so he's putting all of these healings together in a line here. And so it's interesting. This brings up an interesting thought. No other gospels talk about the healing of two blind men in Galilee or in Capernaum. But that is not to say they don't talk about two blind men being healed. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all recount a nearly identical healing outside of Jericho. And Matthew has this in Matthew 20. This will be towards the end of Jesus' ministry as he's making his way up to Jerusalem for the triumphal entry. So this is later in his ministry. As two people were blind, sitting by the road, hearing Jesus passing by, cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." Does that sound familiar? But the crowd warned them to be quiet, and yet they cried out all the more, "Lord, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." So they're calling him the Messiah here. And so certainly these stories seem almost unbelievably similar, right? As The Chosen alludes to, however, Matthew would have kept exact and detailed accounts by virtue of being a tax collector. He would not have made a mistake. It's likely that as other people read the draft of Matthew's gospel, they would have recalled the incident and pointed out a mistake if there was one. So based on those two things, and there are probably others that we can pull in, we could probably rule out the fact that Matthew made an error. So absent a later scribe inadvertently adding this, which doesn't seem to be likely, I didn't see that mentioned anywhere, we have two likely choices, and either one works for me. Matthew either had a thematic reason for reinserting the Jericho healing here, or there were two separate events that had nearly identical circumstances. So either way is fine with me. I think we do see this in Genesis, where we've got three, actually, "she is my sister" sequences that all appear to be identical. Genesis 12, Genesis 20, and Genesis 26. So are those three events? Probably. I mean, that's kind of where I would lean, that all these are separate events. But of course, they went forth and spread his fame. Now, we can imagine how fast news like this would have traveled. So the question is, why does Jesus tell them to keep it quiet? One commentator suggests that it is the specifics of how the healing happened that Jesus wanted to keep quiet, and not necessarily the healing itself. So food for thought. And as they were going out, behold, a demon-possessed man was unable to speak and was brought to him. After the demon was cast out, the man who was unable to speak was able to speak. And this time we get no details whatsoever on the miracle, which I think is interesting. We can probably assume it was the same format as the others, but it's interesting that Matthew doesn't include the details here. The next part, though, is something worth exploring. And the crowds were amazed and were saying, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." But the Pharisees were saying, "He casts out demons by the ruler of demons." And if you're a normal, well-adjusted reader, you think, well, the people recognize Jesus and the wascally Pharisees got it wrong yet again. But let's unpack this a little bit. Of course, we know the crowds were ultimately right, and the group of Pharisees was ultimately wrong. But I think both groups made some errors here that are good for us to take note of. The Pharisees were wrong, but we could say maybe they were wrong this time. But almost every other circumstance, they would not have been wrong. Because there was other activities, super spiritual activity going on that was not from Jesus. And so would they have been likely to be gullible and tricked? And I think the answer to that is yes, because we see this in Acts 10. Now, a man named Simon had previously been practicing magic in the city, astonishing the people, and they said, "This man is the power of God." So we have this being deceived into thinking something was from God that wasn't. So just because the fact they got it right in Jesus' case doesn't mean that they truly understood that this was from God. Now, in later chapters, Jesus will warn against false messiahs and lying signs and wonders. And so we've got to be on the lookout for this. Things that present themselves as being from God aren't necessarily going to be from God. So maybe the crowds were right, but for the wrong reason. Now, the Pharisees were wrong because they were not interested in understanding the power behind the miracle. Again, they also reacted and just assumed that because they didn't like Jesus, that he's doing this by the prince of demons. So maybe they were the skeptic that's not even willing to search out a matter. And what they end up doing is they end up blaspheming at this point. So John in his first letter addresses this exact issue. And I think this is a food for thought for us. Do not believe every spirit. So don't be like the crowd automatically. Don't just say it's from God when you don't know. But John continues, test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. Now, the Pharisees didn't do this either. I mean, they just assumed it wasn't from God. So I think both groups were wrong. And between technology that has the ability to mimic supernatural events and demonic influences that are able to legitimately produce supernatural events, we can't automatically assume that just because someone does something spectacular and they claim to be from God, we can't assume they're actually from God. 2 Thessalonians talks about a strong delusion, and Jesus said the lies at the end of the days will be so convincing that they would deceive the very elect if that were possible. So as we go out in the field, and particularly those who go to places like Africa where some of the spiritual activity is more pronounced, we need to make sure the missionary-minded don't react. We're supposed to test and understand whether this is from God. So don't just assume one way or the other. Understanding is much better than reacting. Jesus was going through all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And it's interesting, we've got a nearly identical quote way back in chapter 4. And what Matthew is doing here is he is bookending a section on Jesus' powerful teaching and deeds with these bookend phrases. So it's interesting here. He's teaching and proclaiming and healing. So he's doing all of these things. And because, we're told the next verse, seeing the crowds, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and downcast like sheep without a shepherd. So I think he's meeting their physical needs, he's meeting their spiritual needs, and he's raising up disciples kind of all in one. These last few verses in chapter 9 might go better with chapter 10 because they're talking about sheep without a shepherd. And I think one of the greatest barometers of how much Jesus we have in us is the degree of compassion that we have for others, and particularly those who are opposite from us in almost every way. We can be against the concept of alternative lifestyles, but do we ache for those trapped in those lifestyles, even though it's most likely their choice? We can be against a corrupt government, but do we ache for the oppressed citizens of that government? Do we see the lost as Jesus sees them? And do we realize the gravity of eternity, that if they don't know him, that they're going to spend eternity without him? So the missionary-minded realize that non-believers in our day, even no matter how antagonistic they are towards us, they are still sheep without a shepherd. And like the original apostles are about to do, we need to go make the name of the Good Shepherd known to them throughout the land by teaching, proclaiming, and meeting physical needs. Now we get to our memory passage. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, plead with the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest." And so, again, memory passage, you may have heard this a little bit differently. Pray to the Lord of the harvest, I think that way works as well. Chuck Missler used to have an expression that without him, we can't, but without us, he won't. And I think this is something that the missionary-minded realize. Jesus' mission is not his alone to execute. And if any of us are sitting on the sidelines, I'm not saying any of us are, but those who are sitting on the sidelines waiting for others to do the work of the ministry are I don't know how to say it, they're not in his will. Jesus wants workers. He wants doers and not hearers only. Every believer is given a spiritual gift to, not for themselves, but to aid the community, to help the fellowship. So it doesn't mean that everyone is supposed to sell everything and move to Africa, but we have to be open to that if God is calling us to that. And so it's all about being open to what he wants for us. It's a good idea to review the various passages on spiritual gifting. I would start with Romans 12 and the part about being transformed in him. We're laying our old life aside and beginning a new work in him. And that work in one way or another involves service to the body. Jesus uses crop and harvest metaphors frequently, although usually, as we saw in the parables, it's to describe the final judgment. In this case, he's actually complimenting the people that they're ready for discipleship. I do like the word pray to the Lord to send workers before we go slashing crops. So we need to make sure we're in the right field, right? That's what praying does. Pray first and then move. If we look closely, we can see this is actually a parable. So the Lord of the harvest is God, the workers are the disciples, and the harvest are those in that generation ready to receive the good news. So we talked in the parable section, we talked about a 3-point parable, and we see this here. Unlike the leaders, the individuals in the crowd are showing signs of fruit and are ready to be harvested. Now, the beginning of chapter 4 talks about Jesus' Talmidim that he elevates to disciples and Talmidim that he elevates to apostles. Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every sickness. And then it goes through the list of the 12 that we've studied previously. We looked at that back in lesson 17. So he had many Talmidim, many disciples, but of those he selected 12 to raise up and be apostles. In a sense, Jesus is saying, okay, now it's your turn to do all of these great works. One commentator wrote, the Jewish model of learning was not just transferring of information, but it involved a transformation of life. And so to be missionary-minded is part of discipleship. It's about doing. It's not about head knowledge. He wants workers. So verse 5 all the way to the end of the chapter is the second of 5 lengthy discourses in the Gospel of Matthew. And so we already looked at the Sermon on the Mount. That was back in chapters 5 and 7. Now we're on the Missionary Discourse, which is Matthew 10. It can also go by the name of the Apostles' Discourse. Matthew puts the kingdom parables after this. We already looked at them before because Luke has the parables happening before all this. And so we're trying to be chronological here, although we don't really know. We're just taking an educated guess. And then we've got the community discourse in Matthew 18 and the end times discourse given on the Mount of Olives and goes by the name of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25. And that has a parable account in Luke chapter 21. Because of the unpleasant subject matter, getting into persecution, the missionary discourse is probably the least studied of these 5 major passages. But of course, being Bereans, we will study this passage in depth. I'm going to skip ahead because there's a verse that Matthew puts at the end that can really help our understanding here. The one who receives you receives me, and the one who receives me receives him who sent me. So we've talked previously about the concept of a sent one, and Matthew puts this at the end, but I think because we're less familiar with that, and the discourse is going to get into mistreatment of a sent one, of the apostle, and then tying in concepts of honor and shame and hospitality, I think we can miss a lot. So I think it's good to keep this passage top of mind as we work through the discourse. So we talked previously, the agent or the apostle, the sent one, has to accurately represent the sender's mission. That was one requirement. No personal agenda. You were completely to represent your master, your sender, exclusively and faithfully. The agent's actions reflect positively or negatively on the sender. So if I'm misbehaving, then people are saying they're forming an opinion about Jesus based on my behavior. Third, and I think what we're going to see a lot in this passage, is how a third party treats the apostle, treats the agent, is just the same as that person's behavior towards the sender. We don't have a direct parallel to this. Agents aren't really, agents get mistreated and it's not viewed as mistreating the hiring party. The closest we might have are international ambassadors. So if we send an ambassador to a foreign country and that ambassador is officially insulted, that is treated the same as an insult to the people of the United States. So that may be the closest we get. But when Jesus says the one who receives you receives me, and then conversely, the one who rejects you rejects me. Now, Jesus goes on to say, they're not just receiving or rejecting me, they're receiving or rejecting the Father. So it's not just the apostle, not just Jesus, but they're accepting or rejecting God the Father. And so with this in mind, as we get into these passages that talk about a judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's like, whoa, where'd that come from? It's because they're rejecting God and they're deserving of that kind of judgment. So with this in mind, we'll circle back to the meat of the passage and go back to verse 5, where Jesus talks about not needing provisions, removing the blessing and shaking the dust. Keep in mind that he's doing that in the context of a culture that expected hospitality. And when that wasn't provided, there was an assumed level of public shame that was going to happen. The 12 Jesus sent out after instructing them, saying, do not go into the road of the Gentiles, do not enter a city of Samaritans, go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And this is actually a picture of the Damascus road that is in the Golan Heights in Israel. And it's just curious that we found this picture because we're coming up on Acts 9 in our Acts study, which is Paul meeting with Jesus on the Damascus road. So we'll have a lot more to say about this road in our Acts study. Jesus self-imposes a restriction to minister to Israel. And in Matthew 15:24, he says much the same. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So his ministry to the few Gentiles and few Samaritans are going to be the exception. After the resurrection, though, things change. And I think a lot more paradigm shifted with the resurrection than we may realize. That is when he says in Matthew 28, make disciples of all nations, i.e. Gentiles. Acts 1:8, be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the remotest parts of the earth. So what we see here in Matthew 10 is a limited ministry, but then after the resurrection, things change. And so the model we're following is Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the remotest parts of the earth, which includes us. The Samaritans will receive the gospel in Acts 8, and the majority of the second half of the book of Acts talks about the going out to the Gentiles. We can see that even in the number of disciples, which is the number 12, it signifies it's a mission within Israel to the 12 tribes. Several of them were lost. They weren't worshiping seriously, no matter what tribe they're from. They were lost spiritually. There's actually two indictments in this section. When he says sheep without a shepherd, that's an indictment against the failed leadership. Remember, they just attributed the works of God to Satan, so they were all messed up. And the second here, the lost sheep, meaning they're lost. They have wandered away from the Lord, and Jesus is going to go seek them out. As you go, preach, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those with leprosy, cast out demons, freely you receive, freely give. So very similar to the passage we looked at that Jesus went from town to town teaching, preaching, and healing. Although these miracles are not insignificant, Jesus is clearly emphasizing concern for God's hurting people. So to demonstrate his authority, he did miraculous works, but to demonstrate compassion, he addressed the physical needs of the people. Now, this is our next missionary-minded thought. If we have evangelism-focused missions without compassion, in other words, where we're placing an emphasis on, tallying up the number of converts, those aren't likely to be successful. They may be reported as being successful, but we don't know how many of those converts actually, realize what they're converting to or converting from. There's a saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So as we go into the field, we need to go and make sure we're meeting physical and spiritual needs in Jesus' name. Our job is to proclaim and meet people's needs and minister, not to convert. The Holy Spirit does the converting. So I would say the missionary-minded are about compassion and are less focused on the number of converts. The kingdom of heaven, again, it's the same message John the Baptist preached, and it's the same message Jesus taught in his early ministry. And it's consistent with the teaching of the Old Testament that God will establish a messianic kingdom. And so now that the Messiah has indeed appeared, the nation was supposed to prepare itself for the king. They're supposed to repent of their sin and submit to God's righteousness. By the way, that's what we're supposed to do too. According to one commentator, and he was talking about Paul's theology, as I said, the resurrection changed everything. So before the resurrection, the mission field was limited to Israel, and people would have had to convert to Judaism in order to be a member of the Jewish community. After the resurrection, everything changes. All of the Old Testament prophecies in Isaiah that talk about including Gentiles, those are now in play. In Acts 2, Peter reads from the book of Joel and on how the God's Spirit is poured out. And so all of that changes after the resurrection. And so the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and then after the resurrection, the kingdom is partially inaugurated. It won't be completed until he comes again. But in this interim we're living in, we have a taste of the kingdom of heaven. Luke's version of this episode has this comment: whenever city you enter and they receive you, eat what is served to you. One reason they could do this is because they were going specifically to Jewish houses. There wouldn't have been an issue of biblically non-kosher food. One thing Jesus could be talking about, and as we've talked about, table fellowship and hospitality was just a huge deal in that culture. They were to avoid the sectarian differences because oftentimes those went above what the Bible said. If someone was serving something that maybe one group called unclean, but still complied with Torah, then Jesus instructs them to partake. Now here's the part in The Chosen that surprised the disciples. They sat there with their jaws hanging open. Do not acquire gold or silver or copper for your money belts, or a bag for the journey, or even 2 tunics, sandals, or a staff, for the worker is deserving of his support. And so this list is about priorities, I think. And so they were shocked because they were looking at it. The disciples were shocked because they were looking at it from the worldly perspective, that how can we go out without these basic provisions? But the missionary-minded are focused on service and sacrifice. And when he's talking about don't take money, it's not about personal gain. This list, as Keener writes, this list is about priorities. And then he writes, the first disciples' obedience to their calling challenges us to consider what we will sacrifice for the work of God's kingdom. So it's, do we trust him? Getting back to that big theme through this lesson, the Lord will provide. The Greek Stoics would be plain, but they would carry a money bag like a modern day tip jar. And so Jesus is in part telling them, don't be like that. Don't peddle miracles for profit, as we saw Simon the sorcerer tried to do in Acts chapter 8. Have faith that the Lord will sustain our efforts. Again, have faith and not fear that these provisional needs will be met. So in that day, those who received Jesus' message, again, we talked about hospitality. So if you received the message, you would be expected to provide food, shelter, and provisions for itinerant apostles. That's just the way it went. And so a double application. We need to support those in ministry, but at the same time, if we're in ministry, we need to avoid every appearance that we're in it for the money or that we expect anything in return. It's kind of a double thought there. If you're on the receiving side, then you give freely receive. But if you're on the giving side, completely rely on God to meet your needs and hope that He works in the lives of other believers. And also, if we don't rely on other people, we're depriving them of an opportunity for ministry. So that's another way to look at it. And whatever city or village you enter, inquire who is worthy in it, and stay in his house until you leave that city. Again, hospitality. As you enter the house, give it your greeting. If the house is worthy, see that your blessing of peace comes upon it. And this is the part that bothers some people. If it is not worthy, take back your blessing of peace. It sounds rough. And again, it's tough to draw a comparison. Our culture is not one of honor and shame, where if you do something wrong, the community lets you know that you've done something wrong. Jesus is not saying here to be petty or vindictive. What he might be saying is, an exposition of what he said in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before pigs. This is just practical instruction. Don't waste time on those who reject. Jesus is saying it simply isn't appropriate to bestow the Lord's blessing of peace, favor, and prosperity in the coming kingdom on someone who rejects the Lord. I mean, we saw that if they reject you, they reject the Lord. That's why I want to look at that verse first. Today, we wouldn't treat someone that we knew was an unbeliever, we wouldn't act like they were a believer. So I think that may be what is going on here. Don't be associated with one who is rebelling against God and making like everything is okay. And just the opposite. We need to warn them of the coming judgment. Removing God's peace was an indication of coming judgment. And so our missionary mindset here, we need to know our audience. We have to discern between those who are naturally willing to listen and those who are just scoffers. We don't waste our time with scoffers. Shalom here, it means peace. It can be short for shalom aleichem, which is peace upon you, peace upon this house. And it's actually, there is a salvation component to the blessing that was bestowed here. It was God's peace, and I've heard it described as shalom is that peace that was in the garden. That's what you're wishing on someone. So remember, if someone accepts or rejects the agent, or the apostle in this case, it is exactly as if the sender, Jesus, was accepted or rejected, and the Father was accepted or rejected. Whoever does not receive you nor listen to your words, so he's talking about rejection here, as you leave that house or city, shake the dust off your feet. Again, don't waste your time. Truly, I say to you, it would be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that city. And that is a striking judgment. And again, we see this concept of public shame. That's what's happening here. Anything connected with the shoes or the feet is considered to be shameful and disgraceful. There was an event in the early 2000s where W. Bush was at a press conference. I think it was in Iraq, and then someone in the crowd threw a shoe at him, and kind of made the news. But that's the idea. It's shame, shame upon you, and symbolized by here's my shoe. There's also another layer, I think, practically speaking, if a guest in a house still had dust on his or her feet, then that means the host had neglected to even provide a bowl for foot washing. So just a disgraceful act, a significant hospitality faux pas in that culture. So Jesus' emissaries are to treat rejecting households as unholy or pagan. And we see an example of this in Acts 13. They shook the dust off from their feet in protest against them and went to Iconium. And the disciples were continually filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. So it's a definite public shame concept that you're making a statement that was pretty common in that culture. Those who have rejected the gospel have made themselves Gentiles and are due the judgment of God, just like that was poured out on Sodom and Gomorrah. So I think there's an element where the mindset has to be, we have to expect rejection when we bring the message of the kingdom. But God sees our rejection, he sees our suffering, and we rely on him to make things right. We don't pursue our own justice. It's interesting as we close here. This is the first instance in Matthew's gospel to end times judgment, and he associates it with a lack of hospitality. And I think it's fascinating that in Sodom and Gomorrah there were actually 3 crimes. One was the sexual sin that was happening in that city. The second was the official acceptance of that sexual sin, and the third was the lack of hospitality. And the sages viewed the lack of hospitality as the greatest of all the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah, worthy of destruction. So again, it's something that we don't have in our culture, but we're trying to get to with our home groups. That we're trying to build up this concept of hospitality and fellowship. But it's just a huge deal in that day, so much so that they viewed the worst sin of Sodom was rejecting the angels and mistreating the angels who were visiting the city. I'll leave you with verse 16. Behold, I am sending you out as sheep into the midst of wolves. So be wary as serpent and as innocent as doves. And so this leads into the second major section of the discourse, which is going to talk about conflict and persecution. And a lot of Bible readers don't like this next part, so we skip over it. Because again, as I said earlier, the words don't fit with a fictional Jesus who wants us to be healthy, wealthy, and have easy lives. But our last missionary-minded thought, disciples can expect persecution, and Jesus wants to prepare us for that. And so that's what we're going to look at next time in Matthew 10, starting with verse 16. We don't want to rush through it. We want to work through it like Bereans and go verse by verse. So we'll tackle verses 16 through 42 next time along the Talmidim way.